The Dakota Territory, 1877. A winter that clawed its way into the bones of the land, a relentless white fury. For Martha, a widow clinging to a desolate homestead, with her young son's survival, was a daily prayer. But when the blizzard hurls a near-dead Lakota warrior broken and bleeding onto her doorstep, her prayer turns into an impossible choice. To save him is to invite danger, perhaps death. To turn him away is to abandon her own humanity. Little does she know, this act of desperate compassion, in the heart of the storm, will forge a bond no frontier hardship can break and bring a gift that will echo through generations. The wind was a living thing, a screeching banshee, tearing at the small, snow-banked cabin Martha Evans called home. It had howled for 3 days now, a monstrous, unending symphony of the Dakota winter. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of pine smoke from the struggling stove and the faint, sweet scent of the last of their hoarded apples. Martha, a woman whose youth had been weathered by loss and hardship rather than years, peered through a small, ice-crusted window pane. All she could see was a swirling vortex of white, the world beyond her small patch of land obliterated. Her son, 8-year-old Tom, sat by the hearth, whittling a piece of scrap wood with a small, dull knife his father had left him. His small face was etched with a worry that mirrored her own, though he tried to hide it beneath a boyish stoicism. "Think it'll ever stop, Ma?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the wind's roar. Martha turned, forcing a reassuring smile. "All storms pass, Tom, even the meanest ones. God wouldn't give us more than we can bear." But her heart clenched. Their firewood was dwindling, the salted meat low. Her late husband John had always ensured they were prepared, but this blizzard had come early with a ferocity she'd never witnessed. John had been gone 2 years, taken by a fever that swept through the small settlement of Redemption Creek, 20 miles east, leaving Martha to manage their small, hard-scrabble farm alone. Redemption Creek. Even the name felt like a distant memory, a world away in this white wilderness. She'd heard whispers, before the worst of the snows hit, of unrest further west near the Pahasapa, the Black Hills. Gold. Always gold, stirring up trouble, pushing men to madness and violence, disrespecting the lands the Sioux held sacred. The cabin groaned under a particularly vicious gust, and a sift of fine snow blew in from under the ill-fitting door. Tom flinched. Maybe we should say a prayer for Pa to watch over us," Tom suggested, his eyes wide. Martha's heart ached. "That's a fine idea, son." She knelt beside him, and they bowed their heads. The wind's howl, their only amen. It was later, as dusk began to bleed into the relentless grey of the storm, that she heard it, or thought she did. A sound that wasn't the wind. A thud, heavy and dull, against the cabin's west wall, the one most exposed to the blizzard's fury. Tom looked up, knife frozen in his hand. "What was that?" Martha put a finger to her lips, straining her ears. The wind shrieked, then momentarily subsided, and in that brief lull she heard it again, a low groan, unmistakably human. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. Who could be out in this? No sane person would travel. Bandits, desperate men, driven mad by the storm. Her hand instinctively went to the old Winchester rifle leaning in the corner. John's rifle. It was loaded. "Stay here, Tom, and be quiet," she whispered, her voice tight. She moved to the door, the floorboards cold beneath her worn leather boots. Peering through the small window again, she could see nothing but the swirling snow. The groan came again, weaker this time, followed by a scraping sound. Her mind raced. It could be a trap, but the sound was one of pure suffering. If it was an animal, it was a large one, and in terrible distress. If it was a man, she unlatched the door, bracing herself against the wind that immediately tried to rip it from her grasp. Snow blasted into the cabin, stinging her face. She shielded her eyes, peering into the white chaos. And then she saw him. A dark shape almost entirely buried in a fresh drift against the cabin wall. A man, an Indian. His clothes were tattered, his dark hair matted with snow, and what looked horrifically like frozen blood. One arm was flung out a hand, clutching a broken spear shaft. He was face down, motionless. Martha's breath caught in her throat. An Indian, out here alone in this storm. The settlers in Redemption Creek spoke of the Sioux with a mixture of fear and contempt, especially with the recent troubles in the Black Hills. Stories of raids of savagery. But this man, he looked less like a threat and more like a broken eagle fallen from a great height. Tom had crept up behind her, his eyes saucers. "Ma, is he—" "Get back, Tom," she said more sharply than she intended. The man wasn't moving. Dead, most likely, frozen solid. She should close the door, pretend she hadn't seen. It was the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But then, a faint puff of vapor, quickly snatched away by the wind, escaped his lips. He was alive. Barely. Martha's resolve, built on fear and caution, wavered. John had been a good man, a man who believed in helping others, regardless of their stripe. "No man deserves to die alone in the cold if you've a fire to share," he'd once said. She looked at the still form, then back at Tom's pale face. This wasn't just about her. It was about what kind of boy Tom would grow up to be, what kind of woman she was. "Tom," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "Help me drag him in. Quickly now." Tom hesitated for only a second before nodding his fear, giving way to a grim determination that made him look so much like his father. Together they fought the wind and the dead weight of the unconscious man. He was heavy, solidly built, though emaciated beneath his sodden hides. Getting him through the doorway was a brutal struggle, snow and icy wind flooding the small cabin. Finally, with a last desperate heave, they pulled him onto the rough-hewn floorboards. Martha slammed the door shut and bolted it, leaning against it, panting, her heart hammering against her ribs. The warrior lay sprawled on the floor, a pool of melting snow, and something darker, beginning to stain the wood around him. The cabin, already small, felt impossibly crowded with the presence of the unconscious warrior. He was a big man, his buckskin clothing, though torn and stained, hinting at fine craftsmanship. A sheath knife, its handle intricately beaded, was still tucked into his belt. His face, partially obscured by matted, raven-black hair, was all harsh angles and high cheekbones, even in its current deathly pallor. Martha worked with a frantic urgency. Tom, her wide-eyed assistant. "Fetch more water for the kettle, Tom, and another blanket, the thickest one." Her first task was to cut away the frozen, blood-soaked layers of his clothing. The cold that radiated from him was terrifying. As she exposed his torso, she gasped. A ragged, ugly gash, crusted with ice and blackened blood, ran diagonally across his ribs. It looked like a bullet grazed deep and festering. Another wound, a puncture that could have come from an arrow or a knife, was high on his left shoulder, oozing sluggishly. His hands were raw, frostbitten. "Ma, he's hurt bad," Tom whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he handed her a strip of clean linen torn from an old petticoat. "He is child, very bad." Martha cleaned the wounds as best she could with warm water and the last of her precious antiseptic herbs. The man didn't flinch, his breathing shallow and erratic. Each rasping inhale sounded like it could be his last. She packed the wounds with a poultice of yarrow and crushed willow bark, remedies her own grandmother had taught her, then bound them tightly. They stripped him of his remaining wet clothes, replacing them with one of John's old woolen shirts and wrapping him in every spare blanket they possessed. Martha dragged him closer to the stove, turning him carefully. His skin was like ice. She rubbed his hands and feet, trying to force circulation back into the frozen extremities, fear a cold knot in her stomach. What had she done? Brought a dying man into her home. A man who could be dangerous if he woke a man whose people might come looking for him, or worse, whose enemies might. The hours that followed were a blur of tending the fire, checking the warrior's faint pulse, and trying to spoon sips of warm broth between his cracked lips. Most of it dribbled out. Tom, despite his initial fear, proved a surprisingly steadfast helper, his small hands less clumsy than she expected, as he held bowls or fetched kindling. As the night deepened, the storm outside seemed to redouble its fury. The wind screamed, rattling the shutters, and Martha found herself jumping at every loud gust. She sat on a low stool beside the unconscious man, the Winchester now resting across her lap. Sleep was impossible. Her mind churned with doubts and fears. Who was he? A Lakota, judging by his features and some of the beadwork patterns she'd glimpsed. What had happened to him? The wounds weren't fresh. They were several days old, inflamed, and likely infected, exacerbated by the brutal cold. He must have been fleeing something or someone to be caught out in such a state when the blizzard hit. She thought of the stories from Redemption Creek, tales of savage warriors of brutal attacks on isolated homesteads. But looking at his vulnerable, unconscious face, she saw not a savage, but a man at the mercy of the elements and his own broken body. There was a harsh sort of dignity about him, even now. Sometime near dawn, with the blizzard still raging unabated, the warrior stirred. A low moan escaped his lips, and his eyelids fluttered. Martha leaned closer, her hand tightening on the rifle. His eyes, when they finally opened, were dark and clouded with fever, but they focused on her with a startling intensity. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He struggled to sit up, a flicker of alarm, then pain crossing his face. "Easy now," Martha said softly, her voice calmer than she felt. "You're safe. You're in my cabin. There's a blizzard." He stared at her, his gaze unreadable. His eyes darted around the small room, taking in Tom, who hovered near the hearth, then settling back on her. He said something, then a few words in a language she didn't understand, his voice rough and weak. Lakota, undoubtedly. She shook her head. "I don't understand." English. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When he opened them again, he spoke his English heavily accented words, clipped. "Where? My homestead. West of Redemption Creek. You were caught in the storm, nearly frozen." He absorbed this slowly. His gaze dropped to his bandaged chest, then to his hands also wrapped. A spasm of pain crossed his features. "Water." Tom, anticipating, was already there with a ladle of water. Martha helped support the warrior's head as he drank his thirst, seemingly unquenchable. "Who are you?" she asked gently when he had finished. He looked at her, a flicker of something, suspicion, caution, in his fever-bright eyes. After a long moment, he rasped, "Kemi, just that," a name that meant coyote or wolf in some native tongues she thought, though she wasn't sure which. "I'm Martha," This is my son, Tom. Keime's eyes shifted to Tom, lingered for a moment, then returned to Martha. Why? He managed the single word, heavy with unspoken questions. Why help him? Why risk it? Martha met his gaze directly. Because no one deserves to die in the snow if there's a fire to share. A faint, almost imperceptible softening occurred around his eyes. He didn't speak again, exhaustion and fever pulling him back under. But before he succumbed, his gaze flickered to the window, to the howling white oblivion beyond, and Martha saw a profound weariness there, a sorrow that seemed as vast as the storm itself. The next few days were a tense vigil. Keime drifted in and out of consciousness. When lucid, he was mostly silent, watchful. His fever raged, and Martha feared he wouldn't last. She coaxed broth and weak herbal tea down his throat, cleaned and redressed his wounds, speaking to him in low, soothing tones, not knowing if he understood or even heard. Tom, losing some of his fear, would sometimes sit quietly, watching the strange man who lay by their fire. He'd ask Martha hushed questions about Indians, questions she answered as honestly as she could, steering clear of the fearful caricatures painted by the settlers. She learned little more about Keime. He offered no information about his people, his journey, or the source of his grievous injuries. Sometimes, in his delirium, he would cry out in his own tongue, words sharp with anguish or urgency. Once she heard him clearly say a name, Tashunka, followed by a torrent of Lakota she couldn't decipher. She also heard phrases that sounded like Paha Sapa, the Black Hills, confirming her earlier guess. One evening, as she changed the dressing on his shoulder, he was unexpectedly lucid. His eyes, though still hazed with fever, were sharp. He watched her hands, his expression unreadable. "You, good hands," he rasped, the effort clear. Martha felt a flush creep up her neck. "Just doing what's needful." His gaze held hers. "Many would not." "I'm not many," she replied quietly. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the ever-present moan of the wind, which after 5 long days finally seemed to be losing some of its ferocity. Keime's eyes drifted to Tom, who was asleep on his pallet, his small face peaceful in the firelight. A different expression flickered across the warrior's face then, something softer, almost melancholic. "Your son?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Tom. He is like the sapling, small but strong." Martha's heart warmed at the unexpected observation. "He is. He has his father's spirit." Keime nodded slowly, then his gaze returned to the crude ceiling of the cabin, a distant look in his eyes. "A father's spirit is a great gift." He closed his eyes, and soon his breathing evened out, though it was still labored. Martha sat back, a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. The initial fear had receded, replaced by a weary sort of acceptance and a growing, grudging respect for the stoic man fighting for his life on her floor. But doubt remained a constant companion. The blizzard wouldn't last forever. When it broke, the world would return, and with it, perhaps the dangers Keime was fleeing. By saving his life, had she endangered her own and Tom's? The question hung in the air, as heavy and oppressive as the snow-laden sky. The blizzard finally broke on the 7th day, leaving behind a world transformed, sculpted into fantastic drifts and valleys of pristine white under a pale, watery sun. The silence, after the wind's ceaseless howl, was almost deafening. For Martha, it was a silence pregnant with unease. The isolation the storm had provided was a double-edged sword. It had kept them safe, but it had also kept them cut off. Now the paths would clear. People could travel. Kimi was slowly, almost imperceptibly improving. The fever had lessened its grip, though it still clung to him like a stubborn burr. He was taking more nourishment, mostly thin broth and gruel, and could sit propped against the wall for short periods. His silences were still long, but his eyes were clearer, more aware. He watched Martha and Tom with an intensity that was sometimes unnerving, yet never overtly threatening. He spoke little, and never, of his past or the reason for his wounds. Martha, meanwhile, began the arduous task of digging out. The snow was piled shoulder-high against the cabin door and had drifted almost to the eaves on the north side. The small barn where her 2 scrawny milk cows and a handful of chickens huddled was nearly buried. It took her the better part of 2 days of back-breaking labor with the shovel to clear a path to the barn and to the woodpile, which was now alarmingly low. Tom helped as much as his small frame allowed, his cheeks red from the cold, his breath pluming in the crisp air. Inside the cabin, Kame would watch them come and go, his expression thoughtful. Once, when Martha returned, exhausted and chilled to the bone, she found he had used a piece of charred wood from the stove to sketch something on a flattened piece of bark. It was a crude but recognizable drawing of a horse, swift and powerful, with a rider leaning low over its neck. He looked up as she entered, then pushed the bark aside, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You need more wood," he stated one afternoon, his voice stronger than she'd heard it. Martha, startled by his directness, nodded. "The pile's low. I'll have to take the axe to the stand of pines down by the creek tomorrow." It was a task she dreaded. Felling trees was man's work, heavy and dangerous. Kami's gaze went to her slender frame, then to her hands calloused and chapped. "Too much. For you. For woman." A spark of defiance lit Martha's eyes. "This woman has been managing for 2 years, Keem. I'll manage this too." He didn't argue, merely inclined his head, a gesture that could have meant respect or disagreement. The thaw brought with it the first visitor. Not to their cabin, thankfully, but Martha saw the distant figure on horseback, making his way slowly along the barely discernible track that led towards Redemption Creek. It was likely a trapper or someone from one of the even more isolated homesteads further west, checking the lay of the land. The sight sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. Word of her guest could not get out. Her biggest fear was how the townsfolk of Redemption Creek would react. They were, for the most part, God-fearing people, but fear of the unknown, especially fear of Indians, ran deep. If they knew she was harboring a Lakota warrior wounded and fugitive, she couldn't even imagine the consequences. Parson Miller, a stern, unyielding man who held considerable sway in the settlement, often preached about the heathen savages and the dangers they posed to civilized folk. A few days later, Kemi was strong enough to stand, albeit shakily, leaning against the wall for support. He moved with a painful stiffness, his wounds still tender, but the iron will that had kept him alive in the blizzard was now bent towards recovery. He would pace the small confines of the cabin for a few minutes each day, his eyes often straying to the Winchester rifle that Martha now kept propped near the door, always within reach. She noticed he never looked at it with longing or ill intent, but with a kind of detached assessment. One afternoon, Tom was struggling to restring his small hunting bow, his brow furrowed in concentration. Kimi watched him for a long while. Then, in his quiet, gravelly voice, he said, "String it too loose. Arrow will not fly true." Tom looked up, surprised. Kame gestured with his chin. Bring. Hesitantly, Tom took the bow and a new length of sinew to the warrior. Keem, with slow, deliberate movements, took the materials. His large hands, despite their rawness and the lingering stiffness from frostbite, worked with an unexpected dexterity. He showed Tom how to twist the sinew for strength, how to notch the bow ends properly, how to create the right tension. He spoke little, using gestures and brief, guttural explanations. Martha watched, a knot of apprehension tightening in her chest. This was a warrior teaching her son the ways of a weapon. But as she observed them, Kame's patient instruction and Tom's rapt attention, she saw no malice, no indoctrination into savagery. She saw a man passing on a practical skill and a boy eager to learn. Good, Kime grunted, finally handing the restrung bow back to Tom. Now, it will find its mark. Tom beamed, his earlier apprehension gone, replaced by hero worship. Thank you, Keme. He ran outside to test it, sending a blunt practice arrow into a snowdrift with a satisfying thwack. Kame watched him go, a rare, almost invisible smile touching the corners of his lips. He turned to Martha. He learns fast. Good eyes. Strong heart. He misses his father, Martha said softly, more to herself than to him. Kame's expression became somber. A boy needs a father, or a man, to show him the path. The implication hung in the air. Was he offering himself in some small way as a temporary guide? The thought was both comforting and deeply unsettling. The following week, Martha knew she could put it off no longer. Their supplies were perilously low. Flour, salt, coffee, all were nearly gone. She had to risk a trip to Redemption Creek to Miller's General Store. The 20-mile ride would be hard, the track still mired in half-frozen mud and patches of deep snow, but it was necessary. She announced her intention to Keme, expecting some reaction, perhaps concern, perhaps an offer to… what? He was still too weak to be of real help, and his presence in town would be a death sentence for them all. He merely nodded, his face impassive. You will be careful. It wasn't a question. Some men, their hearts are small, full of fear. I know, she said. I'll leave Tom here with you. Keep the door bolted. Don't open it for anyone. And keep that rifle close. She hesitated. If there's trouble, Kame's dark eyes met hers. He will be safe. There was a finality in his tone that strangely reassured her more than any lengthy promise could have. The journey to Redemption Creek was as arduous as she'd feared. Her old mare Bess struggled through the mire, and the air, though sunny, was bitingly cold. When she finally rode down the settlement's muddy main street, it felt like entering another world. The sight of other people, the sounds of voices, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, it was almost overwhelming after weeks of near-total isolation. She tied Bess outside Miller's General Store, her senses on high alert. She noticed a group of rough-looking men lounging outside the saloon, their eyes lingering on her a moment too long. They weren't familiar faces from the settlement. Trappers, perhaps, or something else. Their clothes were worn, their guns prominent. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. Inside the store, Mrs. Miller, a woman whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of disapproval, greeted her with a curt nod. Martha Evans, thought the blizzard might have carried you off. We managed Agnes, Martha replied, forcing a pleasantry. As she gathered her meager supplies, flour, salt, a little sugar, and some coffee, keenly aware of her dwindling funds, she listened to the low hum of conversation from other customers. It was then she heard it. A name. Her name. Evans woman up on the North Ridge. Anyone seen her? The voice was male, unfamiliar, coming from a man near the counter, talking to Silas Croft, the town's barber and notorious gossip. Silas stroked his chin. Can't say I have not, since before the big snow. Keeps to herself mostly, since her John passed. Heard tell she's tough. Another voice chimed in, this one belonging to one of the strangers she'd seen outside the saloon. He'd followed her in his eyes like chips of ice. He was tall and wiry, with a cruel slit of a mouth and a long scar that puckered his left cheek. Tough enough to maybe take in a stray, if you catch my meaning. Someone desperate. Martha's blood ran cold. She kept her back to them, pretending to inspect a bolt of calico, her heart pounding. The first stranger spoke again, his voice lower now, more conspiratorial. We're looking for a man. An Indian. Lakota. Goes by the name of Kime or something like it. Wounded. Might have been heading this way, trying to lose himself in the storm. Martha felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her. Keem. They knew his name. They were actively hunting him. Silas Croft scoffed. An Indian. Around here, most sensible folk would shoot one on sight, especially after the stories coming out of the Black Hills. What did he do? The scarred man let out a harsh laugh. Let's just say he crossed the wrong people. There's a sizable bounty on his head, dead or alive, offered by a certain benefactor who wants him silenced. Permanently. He paused, then added, his voice carrying clearly. He was involved in the theft of something valuable, something that didn't belong to him. A benefactor bounty theft. Martha's mind reeled. This was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. These weren't just men driven by fear or prejudice. They were professional hunters, motivated by greed. She paid for her goods, her hands trembling so badly she could barely count out the coins. She could feel the scarred man's eyes on her back as she left the store. She didn't dare look at him. The ride home was a torment. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing hoofbeat. Kime wasn't just a fugitive, he was a hunted man with a price on his head. And she, Martha Evans, a widow with a young son, was harboring him. The fragile peace of their isolated cabin was about to be shattered. The storm outside had passed, but a far more dangerous one was gathering. Martha rode Bess harder than she ever had, the sacks of supplies bouncing precariously. The 20 miles back to the homestead felt like 100 each one, fraught with the terror of discovery. The scarred man's words echoed in her mind. A sizable bounty, dead or alive, wants him silenced. Permanently. She'd seen the type before, passing through Redemption Creek, men with dead eyes and guns, worn loose, their loyalties for sale to the highest bidder. These weren't soldiers or lawmen. They were vultures, circling what they perceived as an easy kill. And Kime, wounded and alone, was their target. What had he stolen? Something valuable, the man had said. Kime, in his delirium, had mentioned Pahasapa, the Black Hills, sacred land to the Lakota, but now overrun with gold prospectors. Had he taken gold, or something more symbolic? Something that struck at the heart of whatever conflict had led to him being hunted. As she neared the cabin, relief warred with dread. Smoke curled from the chimney, a welcome sight, but it also meant Kime and Tom were there vulnerable. She'd left them with a warning, but against men like these. She burst through the door, startling both Tom and Kim. Tom rushed to her, but Kime, who had been attempting to carve something with Tom's dull knife, simply looked up, his dark eyes instantly assessing her state. Trouble, he stated, not a question. Bounty hunters, Martha gasped, dropping the sacks heavily. In Redemption Creek. They're looking for you, Kime. They know your name. They said They said you stole something. Kime's face, already grim, hardened further. He pushed himself slowly to his feet, his hand instinctively going to his healing side. He didn't deny the accusation of theft, Martha noted. A heavy silence filled the cabin, broken only by her ragged breathing. Tom looked from his mother's stricken face to Kime's stoic one, his young mind struggling to comprehend the sudden shift in atmosphere. Bounty hunters, like in the dime novels. Worse, Tom, Martha said, her voice tight with fear. Real ones. Kime's gaze was fixed on Martha. Describe them. She told him about the scarred man, his cold eyes, the casual cruelty in his voice. She described his companion burly and silent. There had been at least 2 others with them outside the saloon. They said there's a bounty, a big one. Kime nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. He walked to the small, ice-crusted window and peered out, scanning the snow-covered landscape. They will come. We have to do something, Martha cried, panic rising. You have to leave Kime, now, before they find this place. If they find you here— She couldn't finish the sentence. The consequences were too horrific to voice, for him and for her and Tom. He turned from the window, his eyes meeting hers. Leave where in this snow, weak as I am. He gestured to his still bandaged wounds. I would not last a day. They would track me easily. But if they find you here, they'll kill you, and us, for helping you. They will kill me anyway, Kime said, a stark finality in his tone. If they find me here, I will not let them harm you or the boy. He looked at Tom, who was watching them, with wide, frightened eyes. The boy, he is brave, like his mother. Martha felt a wave of despair wash over her. Trapped. They were utterly trapped. Her act of compassion had led them to this precipice. What did you steal, Kim? She asked, the question escaping her before she could stop it. She needed to know. If she was to face death, she wanted to understand the reason. Kime was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, heavy, with a sorrow that seemed to fill the small cabin. I did not steal. I reclaimed something sacred to my people, something they had no right to possess. He looked at her, then a deep pain in his eyes. It was taken from the heart of the Paha Sapa, from a winter camp where our old ones and children sheltered. They came, not soldiers, white men with gold fever and whiskey courage. They killed for sport, for shiny rocks. His voice, though quiet, vibrated with a suppressed rage and grief that made Martha shiver. They took many things, but one was a link to our ancestors, a headdress of the winter sky. It holds the stories, the spirit of our northern hunting grounds. It was to be passed to the next shaman, a young man of great promise. Without it, a part of us is lost. Martha stared at him, horrified and enlightened. This wasn't about gold or material wealth. It was about something far deeper, something spiritual. Kime hadn't stolen. He'd been on a rescue mission, a desperate attempt to recover a sacred artifact. Where is it now? She whispered. The headdress. Kime's eyes flickered towards the small bundle of his meager possessions, tucked into a dark corner. Safe. For now. He met her gaze. This is why they hunt me. The man who paid them. He wants it. Not for its spirit, for its decoration. To him, it is a trophy. A cold fury began to burn in Martha, overriding some of her fear. The injustice of it, the casual brutality and desecration Kime described, sickened her. These bounty hunters weren't just chasing a thief. They were complicit in a crime against a people, against their very soul. "They won't take it," Martha said, her voice suddenly firm. "And they won't take you without a fight." She walked to the corner and picked up John's Winchester. She checked the load, her movements surprisingly steady. Keem watched her, a flicker of surprise, then deep respect in his eyes. "You are a strong woman, Martha Evans, like the she-bear defending her cubs." "Tom is my cub," she said, "and this is my den. They are not welcome here." They had perhaps a day, maybe two, before the bounty hunters with their questions and casual cruelty made the connection and followed her tracks back from Redemption Creek. The snow, while a hindrance, also held tracks with terrible clarity. They made what preparations they could. Martha barricaded the door more firmly with the cabin's heavy table. She ensured the rifle was loaded and placed John's old Colt revolver, cleaned and oiled, on the mantelpiece, along with a box of precious cartridges. Keem, despite his weakness, sharpened his sheath knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic rasp a grim counterpoint to the uneasy silence. He showed Martha how to aim the rifle for best effect, how to reload quickly. His instructions were concise, practical, devoid of emotion. Tom, sensing the terrible gravity of the situation, was quiet and subdued. He stayed close to Martha, his small hand often finding hers. She saw the fear in his eyes, but also a dawning understanding, a boyish resolve to protect his home. The waiting was the worst part. Every creak of the cabin, settling every rustle of wind in the pines outside, sent their nerves jangling. Sleep was fleeting, snatched in uneasy patches. Martha found herself praying not for deliverance, but for strength. It was late afternoon on the second day when they heard it, the distant but distinct sound of horses approaching, their hooves crunching on the crusted snow. Keem, who had been resting, was instantly alert. He rose, wincing, and moved to the window, peering through a tiny gap. "4 of them," he said, his voice low. "The scarred one leads." Martha's heart hammered. "Tom, get down away from the window," she ordered, her voice tight. She took her place near the other small window, the Winchester cold and heavy in her hands. The riders emerged from the trees, dark figures against the snow, their movements confident, predatory. They reined in about 50 yards from the cabin, surveying it. The scarred man, Jedediah Thorne, as she'd later learn his name, was smirked, then dismounted, his companions following suit. "Martha Evans," Thorne's voice boomed across the snow. "We know you're in there, and we know who you're hiding. Send out the Lakota dog, and we might just let you and the boy walk away from this." Martha's grip tightened on the rifle. Walk away. She knew that was a lie. They were witnesses, accomplices in Thorne's eyes. Keem moved beside her, his own knife in hand. He looked pale, his breathing still shallow, but his eyes burned with a fierce light. "They will not have what they came for," he murmured. "No," Martha agreed. "They will not." Thorne waited a moment, then sneered. "Have it your way then. Don't say we didn't warn you." He drew his pistol, gesturing to his men. "Burn 'em out if we have to, but I want that Indian alive if possible. The boss wants to have a word before he dies." One of the men dismounted and unslung a torch, dousing it with oil from a flask. Martha's blood ran cold. Fire. Her greatest fear in this wooden tinderbox of a cabin. "Keem," she whispered urgently, "the headdress. Where can we hide it if they get in?" Keem's eyes darted around the small space. Then he looked at Tom, who was crouched near the hearth, watching with terrified fascination. Keem moved quickly towards the boy. "Tom," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "you are small, quick, There is a loose stone in the hearth on the left side. Can you move it? Tom, startled, nodded. He scrambled to the hearth, his small fingers probing. He found the stone Kimi indicated, and with some effort, managed to pry it loose, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Kim retrieved his small bundle and carefully, reverently took out the sacred headdress. Even in the dim light of the cabin, it was magnificent. Crafted from the hide of a white buffalo, adorned with eagle feathers that seemed to shimmer, intricate beadwork depicting starry skies and soaring birds, and ermine tails that cascaded like frozen waterfalls. It pulsed with an almost tangible aura of age and power. This is the Wiyakpa Paha, Keme whispered using the Lakota name, the headdress of the winter sky. It must not fall into their hands. He carefully folded it and pushed it into the cavity. Cover it, Tom, quickly. Tom replaced the stone just as the first shot rang out, splintering the wood of the door. The splintering crack of the gunshot shattered the tense silence, followed by a whoop from one of Thorne's men. Getting antsy in there, are we? Thorne yelled, his voice laced with malicious amusement. Martha flinched, but held her position at the window, the Winchester pressed to her shoulder. Stay down, Tom, she reiterated, though the boy was already pressed flat against the floor near the hearth, his eyes wide with terror. Keem had moved to the other side of the door, his knife gripped tightly, his body tensed like a coiled spring. Despite his evident weakness, they will try the door first or the windows, he said, his voice a low growl. Do not waste shots. Aim true. I will, Martha said, her own voice surprisingly steady. The initial wave of panic had subsided, replaced by a cold, focused anger. These men threatened her child, her home. They would not find her an easy target. Another shot slammed into the cabin wall near her window, sending a shower of wooden splinters inwards. She ducked instinctively, then peered out again. Two of the men were advancing cautiously towards the cabin, using the sparse cover of a few snow-laden bushes. Thorne and the fourth man, the one with the torch, stayed back, directing them. The one on the right, Keem murmured. He is overconfident. Martha sighted down the barrel. Her hands were sweating, but her aim was steady. She'd hunted deer with John. She knew how to handle the rifle. She waited until the advancing man paused, then squeezed the trigger. The Winchester boomed the recoil, jarring her shoulder. The man yelped, clutching his leg, and stumbled back, falling into the snow. He wasn't dead, but he was out of the fight for now. Damn, Thorne roared. She can shoot, spread out, flank them. The remaining advancing man dove for cover, disappearing behind a large snowdrift. The man with the torch began to move, circling towards the blind side of the cabin where the woodpile stood. The fire, Martha, Kimi hissed. He will try to burn us from the back. Martha knew she couldn't cover both sides. I have this side. Can you? Keem nodded grimly. I will delay him. He moved towards the back wall, which had no windows, only the rough-hewn logs. He listened intently, then, with a sudden, desperate strength, he began to pry at one of the chinking strips between the logs with his knife. Outside, Thorne was shouting orders, his voice raw with anger. Rush the damn door, you fools! She can't watch everywhere at once. The man who had taken cover behind the snowdrift broke from his position, charging towards the front door, firing his pistol wildly. Bullets thudded into the logs. Martha swung the Winchester, fired again. The shot went wide, kicking up snow near the man's feet, but it made him hesitate, giving her precious seconds to reload. At the back of the cabin, Kime had managed to create a small slit just wide enough to see through. He could see the torchbearer approaching the woodpile, his face illuminated by the flickering orange light of the brand. The man was about to touch the flame to the dry tinder. Kime knew he couldn't let that happen. With a grunt of pain and exertion, he braced himself and kicked out with all his might at the log below his peephole. The wood, old and stressed, groaned but didn't give. He kicked again, a desperate, agonized sound tearing from his throat. This time, the log splintered, creating a jagged opening. The torchbearer, startled by the noise, looked up just as Kim, with a speed that belied his injuries, thrust the broken spear shaft he still carried, the one he'd fallen with, through the opening. The sharpened point, though crude, found its mark, sinking into the man's shoulder. The man screamed, dropping the torch, which sputtered and died in the wet snow. He staggered back, clutching his arm, his attack thwarted. But the effort cost Kimi dearly. He slumped against the wall, gasping for breath, fresh blood seeping through the bandages on his side. He'd bought them time, but he was fading fast. At the front, the attacker, emboldened by Martha's missed shot and Kimi's audible cry of pain from within, renewed his charge at the door. He reached it, slamming his shoulder against the wood, trying to break the barricade. Martha, her reload complete, aimed carefully. She didn't want to kill, not if she could avoid it, but she would. She fired. The bullet hit the heavy wooden door near the man's head, sending a large splinter flying that struck his cheek. He howled in pain, and surprise, stumbling back, his enthusiasm for a direct assault considerably dampened. Jed, I'm hit!" The man who'd been shot in the leg cried out from where he lay. The one Kimi had speared was also moaning, nursing his shoulder. Thorn cursed violently. 2 men down, one of them by the Indian he'd assumed was half dead. He looked at the cabin, its windows like dark, watchful eyes. This wasn't going as planned. The woman was a fighter, and the Lakota, even wounded, was dangerous. He still had 1 man with him, but their nerve was clearly shaken. "All right, Evans," Thorn shouted, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. "You've made your point. We'll pull back for now, but this ain't over. We'll be back, and next time we'll bring enough men to tear this whole damn place apart, log by log." He and his remaining unwounded man helped their injured comrades onto their horses. Thorn gave the cabin one last venomous glare. "You'll regret this, woman, you and your redskin lover." Then they were gone, riding back towards the trees, leaving behind a trampled, blood-stained patch of snow and 2 men groaning in pain. Silence descended, heavy and fraught. Martha lowered the Winchester, her arms trembling from the adrenaline. Tom, who had been preternaturally quiet throughout the exchange, let out a shaky sob. She rushed to him, pulling him into a fierce hug. "It's all right, Tom. They're gone. We're safe for now." Then she remembered Kim. She turned. He was slumped against the back wall. His eyes closed, his face ashen. The front of his borrowed shirt was dark with fresh blood. "Kimi!" She scrambled to his side, Tom following. The days that followed Kimi's death were shrouded in a heavy silence, broken only by the necessities of survival and the quiet grief that filled the small cabin. Martha, with Tom's reluctant help, wrapped Kimi's body in their cleanest spare blanket. They couldn't bury him in the frozen ground, not yet. So they carried him to the small, ice-cold root cellar beneath the cabin, a place of grim sanctuary until the thaw truly came. Saying a prayer over his still form, Martha felt a profound sense of failure mixed with her sorrow. She had saved him from the storm, only to lose him to the violence of men. Thorn and his men did not return immediately. Perhaps their injuries were more severe than she'd thought, or perhaps they were gathering a larger force as threatened. Every sound outside the cabin, the snap of a frozen branch, the call of a distant wolf, sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through Martha. She kept the Winchester close, and Tom, now acutely aware of the danger, became her little shadow, his earlier boyishness replaced by a somber maturity. He asked about Kime often. "Will Kime go to heaven, Ma, with Pa?" Martha, struggling with her own beliefs and the complexities of Kime's Lakota spirituality, could only say, "Kime was a brave and honorable man, Tom. I believe his spirit is free now, in a good place, just like your Pa's." She thought often of Kime's last words, of the headdress, of the winter sky hidden beneath the hearthstone. "It is for your son." The weight of that bequest was immense. It was more than a gift. It was a sacred trust, a dangerous inheritance. What was she to do with it? Kime had mentioned his father, Chief Black Moon of the Miniconjou Lakota. How would she ever find him? And what if Thorn returned before she had the chance? Spring arrived, slowly, reluctantly, the iron grip of winter gradually loosening. The snow began to melt, first in patches, then in earnest, turning the land into a muddy quagmire. The days grew longer, and the first green shoots of hardy prairie grass appeared. With the true thaw, Martha and Tom performed the grim task of burying Kime. They chose a spot on a small rise overlooking the creek, beneath a cluster of young aspens whose leaves trembled in the gentle spring breeze. Martha fashioned a simple wooden cross, though she knew it wasn't Kime's tradition. It was all she could offer. "He was a good man, Tom," she said, as they stood before the fresh grave. "He protected us." Tom, his small face serious, nodded. "He taught me about the bow and courage." As the land dried, Martha's anxiety grew. The bounty hunters could return any day. She considered abandoning the homestead, fleeing to Redemption Creek, but the thought of facing the townsfolk, of explaining Kime, was daunting. Besides, where would they go? This small, isolated cabin was their only home. One late spring morning, about 2 months after the shootout, Tom came running into the cabin, his face pale with alarm. "Ma riders, lots of them coming from the west." Martha's heart leaped into her throat. Thorn. He'd come back. She grabbed the Winchester, her hands surprisingly steady. "Tom, get to the root cellar. Stay there until I call you, no matter what you hear." "But Ma..." "Go," she commanded, her voice sharp with urgency. Tom, tears welling in his eyes, obeyed, disappearing through the trapdoor. Martha moved to the window, peering out. It wasn't Thorn. This was a much larger party, at least 20 riders, and they were all Indians. Dressed in buckskin and adorned with feathers and beads, they rode with a quiet, formidable dignity. They were armed, but not in an overtly aggressive manner. They moved with a purpose, their dark eyes scanning the landscape, their faces stern and unreadable. Fear different from what Thorn had inspired, but no less potent, gripped her. Were these Kime's people, or enemies? Had word of his death reached them? The riders fanned out, forming a loose semicircle around the cabin, their ponies snorting and stamping in the soft earth. One man, older than the others, with a deeply lined face that spoke of wisdom and sorrow, and wearing a magnificent eagle feather headdress, though not the one Kime had described, dismounted and walked slowly towards the cabin. He stopped about 20 paces from the door, his gaze intense. Martha held the rifle, but did not raise it to her shoulder. She waited. The man spoke, his voice deep and resonant, carrying clearly in the still morning air. He spoke in Lakota. Martha, of course, didn't understand. She opened the door a crack. "I don't understand your tongue," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you speak English?" The old man's eyes narrowed slightly. He conferred briefly with a younger warrior beside him. Then The younger man stepped forward. "He is Chief Black Moon," the warrior said, his English accented but clear. "He seeks his son, Keme." Keme was last seen traveling this way wounded before the great blizzard. Martha's heart ached. This was Keme's father. The moment Keme had spoken of the moment of reckoning was here. "Keme was here," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped out of the cabin, leaving the rifle just inside the door, a gesture of trust, or perhaps weary resignation. "He was gravely wounded. I took him in." Chief Black Moon's stoic expression did not change, but his eyes seemed to bore into her, searching for truth. "Where is he now?" the younger warrior translated. Martha's gaze dropped. She pointed towards the small rise to the cluster of aspens and the simple wooden cross. "He is buried there. He died, protecting us, protecting this home." And so Martha and Tom's lives were forever changed, not just by the harshness of the frontier, but by the unexpected grace found in the heart of a storm. Keme's sacrifice and the incredible gift of the headdress of the winter sky became a whispered legend in their family, a testament to courage, honor, and the bridges that can be built between even the most divided peoples. A reminder that even in the deepest winter, acts of kindness can sow the seeds of an unexpected spring. What did you think of Martha's story and Keme's legacy? Did the bravery of these characters touch your heart? Let me know your favorite moment or twist in the comments below. If you enjoyed the Blizzard's gift and want to hear more tales of the untamed West full of drama and unforgettable characters, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with fellow story lovers, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure. Thanks for listening.